So just a little bit of an overview of the workshop series itself. So today's workshop, I'm going to introduce what is blended learning, how you might blend your course, and think about a variety of different aspects of a blend and how you should make that work. That's today. The second workshop's in February, and for that workshop we have two guest speakers coming who have used Blend in two quite entirely different ways, so that you can have some examples beyond mine and your own, two different kinds of examples from different disciplines where they have used Blend. So there'll be opportunity for them to present and for discussion, get some ideas from them. And then the third workshop in March will be focusing on design in the online, because one of the things that we also found from that survey was that online or blended, it didn't matter. When students come online, sometimes it's very difficult for them to navigate through systems because everything's different and often not well designed. So the third workshop, Adrian is going to present some ideas about good design in online context, but also give you an opportunity to sort of practice and think about what you're, given what you want to do, what should your online component look like. Okay, and because we're such a small group, we should say actually, particularly for the February, if you can really commit to coming in February, because it would be awful for those people to make that commitment and then not have anybody here. So if you can make that commitment, we'd really appreciate that. Okay, so I want to start by telling you about an article I read by Tony Bates, who's done a whole lot of work on online learning in general. But last year he wrote this piece called 2020 Vision, Outlook for Online Learning in 2014 and Way Beyond. So he was talking about a range of things, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting, he said, I'm just going to read the quote. He says, he foresees the disappearance of online learning as a separate construct. In 2020, people won't be talking about online learning as such because it'll be so integrated with teaching and learning more broadly. And I think that although he was projecting out for 2020, I think blended learning is already doing that, and we could probably do it better than we are, which I think everybody's kind of still struggling with what is it and how can we do it well. But I think that the blended learning, a blended course actually does that really well. It does take that, it does kind of merge those two things together and really well. So what is blended learning? There are two definitions here. The first is the basic and obvious one. It mixes face-to-face and non-face-to-face activities. Some of those might be performed synchronously, some asynchronously, one or the other, whatever. So that's pretty straightforward. It's the Torresi and Steele definition that we're going to explore more, though. They say blended learning refers to enriched, student-centered learning experiences made possible by the harmonious integration of various strategies achieved by combining face-to-face interaction with various technologies. So the focus here is what's the student doing? What's the student learning? How do we integrate both the face-to-face and the online? And that's a piece that is so important but really challenging to figure out. And combining the how, what are you doing where and why kind of connects to that integration piece. So yeah, in general, blended learning is face-to-face and online somehow connected to one another. But I think more importantly, it's about that harmonious integration. So that's really, there's a lot of different things, but I think number one, that's really where we want to focus. Okay, so of course, I have to use the image for blended learning because I think it kind of gets us thinking a bit further along the lines of what does it mean to blend. So my blender at home, I have a cheap one. It says it pulses, chops, mixes, grates, blends, and liquefies. I don't think it really does much more than mix, sort of. And then there's these big chunks left behind, right? And so this idea of really what blend means is a really important one. However, I think with a really good blend, it could be any one of those things. It could be pulse chop, mixed grade blend, or liquefy. It could be any of those things, really depending on how much online, how much face-to-face you want. And that depends on what you really want to do. It's not hard. It's not like I'm going to say, ideally, you should have X amount of online or X amount of face-to-face, or you should be doing this here and that there. It's not really about that. It's about figuring out what's right for your context. So, for example, perhaps there's just one aspect or one component of your course online. Perhaps, for example, there's an interactive quiz that students do after the lecture that encourages them to think about the material after they leave the lecture, assess their own learning after they leave the class. On the other hand, perhaps you've got all your course material online, maybe through short videos, readings, maybe there's some quizzes folded into that. And then, Jan, as you mentioned, maybe the classroom becomes this problem-solving group, case study sessions, so there's a division that way. And some faculty take that approach in larger classes, so pushing the material out, you mentioned that too, and then bringing the activity to the classroom, which comes back to that definition about, well, we want to make things interactive. Or perhaps your face-to-face component only allows, or you still really need the lecture, the students really need the lecture component, the face-to-face lecture component somehow, so you take the discussions online. Now, none of one of those scenarios are better or worse. It just depends what you want to do. So, why blended learning? So the literature talks about various advantages. Advantages for students around flexibility and accessibility. Flexibility in terms of how, when, where students are learning. And accessibility, again, in terms of the same sorts of things. If it is interactive, interaction and engagement can be an advantage of blended learning, because if, like you say, you have a 2-hour lecture slot and you feel like you've got all this stuff and you feel like really you have to fill those 2 hours with lecture, then there's no opportunity for interaction and engagement. So can you push that online, or can you push out the material online and bring the discussion into the class, whatever. Generally speaking, the literature shows that with a blended course, there's improved learning outcomes. This is because there is this continuous learning process. So it's not like, okay, I go to biology for 2 hours, then I'm done for the week, and I don't think about it again until I go back into the class. That constant interaction with both the face-to-face and then the reiteration, support, continuation, whatever it may be on the online, allows for that, the learning to continue. And the last one, sort of a culmination of all of those things, that students have such limited time. Students are commuting to class. Students are working. They have families. Blended learning, particularly blended learning, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, that reduces in-class time, which can also be an institutional advantage, and pushes some of the time to a flexible time frame, can also be an advantage for students and for faculty too. Gives more flexibility. On the other hand, there are challenges. Anything that goes online does, at least initially, but sometime in the long term, particularly if it's interactive, increases workload for faculty and students. So the issue of how much work and how much work when is a really important point, because adding an online component to an already established course can increase the workload for everybody. So then you could actually be doing 2 courses in one. It's really important to kind of rethink and balance those 2 things for yourself as well as the students. Sometimes it can be challenging because there's insufficient support for students online or for faculty in creating that. So we're trying to offset that. That can be a challenge. Sometimes students find it a challenge, so do faculty, if they're using all the bells and whistles of the technology for the sake of it, and the students can't really figure it out, and in fact it's not really working well, and or it's not meaningfully integrated, it's just for the sake of the technology. That can be challenging. This next one I think is really important. Students' resistance to or lack of readiness to engage in active independent learning. Some of the things I've been reading recently say that it can be really challenging for first-year students to do a blended course because they have been well established in this educational system that tells them what to do, when to do it, how to do it. So when you say, it's all there, be on your own, and it's kind of contrasts to the flexibility and accessibility, and then you can be kind of stuck. So students may just not do it. You might put a grade on it. Students may not do it well, or it could cause students to potentially not do as well as they might do in that more structured framework. So it does raise some questions about how do you prepare students for a blended learning context. The other interesting piece is that students generally at Dalhousie, but broadly across the literature too, really do want face-to-face. They do want to retain that, which I have to say is surprising to me in a universe where you just see people all sitting together but in their technology. It's interesting that all the literature seems to show that people actually do want to come together, that there is something valuable for them in coming face-to-face with other people and talking to a human being directly. So I think that can be a challenge of blended learning, but I think in a way it could also, actually I could have put it on the advantages side because the blended does retain the face-to-face. I put continuous learning experience across advantages and challenges because I think it does improve learning outcomes because it is continuous, but on the other hand, if students don't engage in it or feel overwhelmed by it, it's a challenge. Okay, and I put a slide in here about this, but Adrian already mentioned it. These are some stats from our online surveys. Why blended learning at Dal? And as you can see, both students and teachers really highly rank blended learning significantly, actually over online, and even more so than face-to-face alone. So clearly there's a sense of, an intuitive sense of the recognition of the advantages of having both together. And in addition to that, they all said, 41% of students in particular, and even 22% of teachers said that they want more interaction online. So what is it, 90-some odd percent of courses at Dal have a Blackboard site, but the majority of those people are using it to just put up information, perhaps run tests and that sort of thing, but not really in that interactive way. Either interactive with material or interactive with peers or interactive with the instructor. Okay. So this is a nice concept map of blended learning. Blended learning, one has to decide about the environment, decide about the medium, but what I like about this map is that our eye is drawn to the context of teaching and learning, which again is the message really being that it's really important not to get bogged down in the medium and whether you're doing it synchronously or asynchronously, but to think about best practices of teaching and learning and the best practices around blended learning, as I've already discussed, and to have that focus on the learning. So if the technology is overwhelming the learning, that's not useful. And here's another one that just has, I like this because it has some good questions. And I think these are the questions that are really important to answer when you're thinking about should my course be blended or not. Can the learning experience be made better as a result of blending the course? What do my students need to learn? How do my students learn best? And given that, how can I best get my students to engage and learn it? Is it through blended learning? So it's kind of iterative. And you could do that for each component of the course to think about which piece is maybe where. So there are three main categories of thinking we're going to do today. And these are them. And then there's going to be a fourth at the end that sort of adds on to it. The main approaches or considerations around blended learning include focusing on student learning, that integration piece that I already mentioned, and flexibility. And what does that truly mean? And then as a result of thinking about those things, there's the question of whether or not making a course a blended learning course has any direct impact on the learning outcomes for your course. Does it change the learning outcomes? Does it add learning outcomes? That's a possibility. Or does it just enhance the learning outcomes you already have? I don't think it matters, but I think it's which it is. But I think again, it's important to think about your learning outcomes in relation to blended learning. So we're going to start by thinking about the approaches to student learning. So, as I already mentioned, the literature really argues that the blended approach to student learning can enhance student learning because there's an increased independent learning and increased collaborative learning. There's also an argument that the multiple modalities of learning reach more people in different ways, and that enhances learning across increasingly diverse and broad range of students in any particular course. The literature argues, though, that in a blended course, the teacher's role should, I don't know, change in some instances, because in both the face-to-face or online, or one or the other, the teacher's role is going to become much more facilitative than directive. And the literature says that for some instructors that's a really difficult shift to make. So I'm guessing for most of you, because I know a little bit about each of you, that maybe that's less of a problem. But I would say that if, for example, you've got a course in which you only lecture, then even if you've got another course where you do a lot of facilitated stuff, shifting a course that's been largely talking, and shifting it to something else, I think does take some mindset considerations. I just wanted to talk briefly about presence in the online environment because one of the things the literature talks about in the context of the online part of the course is how important presence is to make that successful. And they talk about three things: instructor presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. Instructor presence isn't what you think it might be. Instructor presence is seen in the design and facilitation direction of the course. So it's really that design component, how you put things together. And I think we often don't think about that enough, and Adrian will talk more in the third workshop about how important that design process is in order to have a sense of instructor presence or not. So that design component really has an impact on ensuring successful learning outcomes. Social presence, everybody can bring their individual personality to the course. That's the instructor and the students. And so there's that component. But there's also this aspect of creating a trusting community environment, which can be challenging in a face-to-face environment, becomes more challenging in an online environment. Although I have to say, there is a great advantage, I think, to meeting people face-to-face for you as the instructor and for the students, and then moving that online. It just feels different than, I think, than never having, it's just a bunch of people out there that you've never met. I think the community you create in the classroom can lap over into the online environment. And cognitive presence. So that is the previous two things fold into the cognitive presence. That is allowing for both independent work in the online environment and for collaborative work, resulting in both the instructor and the students engaging intellectually in a deep way in the material. So to get away from the kinds of posts that say, yeah, I agree, and really every student actually engaging with each other person's comments in a meaningful way, will allow for increased and deeper learning. Okay, so I posed some questions for discussion, and we'll maybe spend like 10-15 minutes thinking about some of these things. So Adrian sent out an email saying that have a course in mind, which you do. So given that, how can you redesign your course to enhance students' independent and collaborative learning by using a blended approach? How will you conceptualize your role as a teacher? Would it have to shift? Would it not? What would that mean for you? What activities do you currently use to assist students in obtaining their learning outcomes, and how would these activities change in a blended learning class?